This is the second part of the Chapter 6, Section 4 lecture. There's only 2 slides to cover here, but they are the case studies that are in the book, and so I wanted to make sure to go over them with you. Both of these case studies deal with decreasing total fertility rates in our 2 most populous countries. That would be China and India. So the first case study talks about China, and since 1972, we have seen a total fertility rate drop from 5.7 to 1.6. And if you remember from our case studies, we even looked at their peak of fertility rates being in the 1960s, where they were closer to 6, around 5.9. And so what we have seen with the one-child policy is that there was a success. It was incredibly beneficial at reducing fertility rate, and that was the ultimate goal because remember, China was concerned about feeding a growing population. It does encourage fewer children, and the way it does this is with penalties and rewards. So the incentives to have one child, or the government is going to help you by providing more food or a better supply, a more adequate supply, larger pensions for retirement money. Again, that was one of the things we said would help determine how many children you were going to have. If you didn't have a pension, you needed more kids. Well, China said, okay, well, we're going to give you then more pension money, better housing, free health care, salary bonuses, and free tuition for your child. So they're offering free education. They're offering so many things that are really great, especially for a struggling society. And remember, China until recently was not doing that well economically. And so these are great incentives. There are some penalties. They deal mostly with taxes, and we know from the news that there were some abuses of power that led to governments doing some pretty torturous things, and even individuals doing a bit of infanticide on their own and killing off the females. So what we have seen is a gender imbalance, especially since the advent of ultrasound. There's an old saying in China that, when translated, says, rear a son and protect yourself in old age. It's the son who traditionally is going to take care of the parents. And so having a female, she gets married off and becomes part of another family, and then you have nothing to fall back on. So again, one of the things that is important to negate that is that pension, but you can't just undo what centuries and tons of tradition have taught your culture. And so again, they value the sons much more than the daughters. This has led to a bride shortage, which we were discussing in class with case study 6, and that bride shortage has started to result in kidnapping. Now, in class, a couple of the videos that were shown were in China, and then a few of them were in Kyrgyzstan. And what we see in Kyrgyzstan is more of a cultural type of kidnapping. But remember from our case study that the impending population crisis is really not going to hit for at least another 20 years. It's that age group from 0 to 4 right now where the boys outnumber the girls 123 to every 100. So as that generation ages, that's when we're really going to start to see this. Ultrasounds were not even around until the 80s, and certainly not terribly common until the late 80s into the 90s. And so it's those generations that have really seen this gender imbalance. And so this issue of kidnapping a wife will continue to get worse unless there is some government intervention. They do have a fast growing economy, and that might help. Remember, they talked about with the bride kidnapping, the part of the reason is that the men cannot afford the bride price plus the marriage ceremony. So it's cheaper to buy a bride than to actually woo and marry a woman. So hopefully, the economic growth can help. But they also, remember, in China are going to face serious resource and environmental problems because those things are just linked strictly to their population growth. We do see, though, a lot of issues with this gender imbalance, and that's ultimately one of the new lessons to learn from China. It used to be that we were learning the lessons of what it meant to enforce a policy related to population. And we saw it as a very negative thing because obviously in a democracy, we don't want people telling us what to do. But you do have to, I think, at least appreciate the fact that China recognized a problem that was very serious if they had not done something. And did it have to be as drastic, as dramatic? I don't know. I'm not a policy advisor. But what I do know is that it helped them in the long run to accomplish their goals. Now they're going to have some other issues because they're going to have an imbalance with the old versus the young. But again, we will see where they go from there. Now in India, the interesting juxtaposition is that India had the world's first family planning program, and it was started in 1952, whereas China's one-child policy wasn't until the 1970s. So they've got a beat on them by 20 years, but they did not have the success. One of the reasons for that, it was not as enforceable because you don't have a communist government. And so that is definitely a major reason. But you have to give credit to India for, again, realizing that they were having an issue and doing something about it. And they have had a decrease in total fertility. So it has been a success, but not like we've seen in China. We do see the problem in India of gender bias. And this has led to a growing population because, again, without that one child policy, what you tended to see in India is a family that would continue to have children until they had a boy. And I don't know how much of this still goes on today, but I do know that my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, is Indian. She is the first of a family of four. The first three were girls, then a boy, and then they stopped. So I do know that even, as far as my generation goes, there is an effect of this gender bias in that population. And some of you guys would even know more about this because of your cultural heritage. India does have a real problem with poverty. Only 18% of the population has access to sanitation. And so we are dealing with a growing population in an area that can ill afford to provide for and protect them from everything that they need protection from. 80% of the population lives on less than $2 a day. So we are talking about some poverty, but some abject poverty, some um, real low as far as compared to other countries. We can talk about poverty in many different ways, but when we look at that less than $2 a day, we're talking Haiti type poverty. We're not talking about Honduras type poverty. Both places have poverty, sure, but this is the type of poverty that is very life threatening. One of the issues that goes along with poverty is malnutrition, and 40% of the population suffers from this. Malnutrition, again, simply just not getting enough to eat or not getting enough of the proper things to eat. They're both considered to be malnutrition. So you can be getting plenty of calories from rice, but if you're not augmented with a protein, then you're going to have malnutrition effects. And again, just like in China, this is going to lead to some severe environmental problems. Hopefully you remember from our timeline at the beginning of the year, what happened in India was the Union Carbide plant that, it was a chemical plant that exploded releasing toxic gas. Again, that was in Bhopal, India. And so they've already suffered some pretty severe environmental issues. But with that huge of a population in that small of a space, India is far smaller than China, and they have roughly the same population. Obviously, that puts a burden on your space, on your planet. And India is projected to continue to grow at a faster rate than China, again, because they do not have that one-child policy. So two case studies for you. We've talked a lot in class about China, haven't talked as much about India, but you do need to realize that they have enacted some support of family planning and it was successful. And ultimately that's what our articles are calling for, especially the op-ed pieces by Christoph, is calling for some type of family planning support in countries or from the United Nations for other countries who can't afford it themselves. And again, what you're saving here is you're saving unwanted pregnancies, you are saving abortions, and you are saving women's lives, because these girls that are being forced to marry at such young ages cannot have pregnancies without complications. So that's the end of chapter 6. It's a really interesting chapter. I suggest that you make sure that you know a lot about your population pyramids, that you know about those demographic transition models, and that you understand how all of this is linked together. We've got really important vocabulary in this unit, so make sure that you're aware of those words. All of the acronyms, IMR, TFR, ZPG, they come up a lot. Make sure you know your equations for doubling time and population growth, and make sure that you understand how total fertility rate can be impacted by those 10 different factors. Those are the major issues to cover in chapter 6. You do have some review questions that are based straight out of the book, so you can get book help from that. You can get help from the book with that. And that's all for chapter 6.